going to talk for a few moments about a king worth having. Kings, not necessarily from 1st and 2nd Kings in the Old Testament that we're going to talk, but about a king worth having. I started a master's degree after taking 7 years to finish my undergraduate degree. It's a wonder they let me into grad school. They probably knew I wouldn't finish, which I didn't. At least not in medieval history, which I loved. I had an incredible infatuation, so to speak, with medieval history and with one of the people who taught as my instructors. And among other things, I was captivated by some of the kings in medieval times. Henry VIII. He was a king of England, a name that's familiar, I would suspect, to all of us. He was in the time of Luther, when Luther was reforming Germany. Henry had 6 wives. The first was Catherine, which is kind of a good news, bad news deal, really. There were 4 children born in a row, but they were either born dead or they had died shortly after they were born. The 5th child survived, but it was frail and it was a girl. And Henry, of course, wanted someone to succeed his throne, a male child. The 6th was stillborn. Well, it was obvious to Henry that he needed a new wife. Apparently things weren't going well with this one. But the Pope at the time wouldn't grant him a divorce. So King Henry VIII simply said, "From now on, I'm the head of the Church of England." Not surprisingly, he granted his own request to divorce Catherine. Some of his other wives weren't so fortunate. Some he severed by severing their heads. A king truly not worth having. Another king of England, George III, gave the colonists in America incredible grief and turmoil. Thomas Jefferson would spell it out in the Declaration of Independence. King George III sent these soldiers to live free among the colonists and at their expense. They were murderous soldiers who were protected by mock trials. They imposed burdensome taxes on the colonists without their consent, suspended colonies' governments. Not a king worth having. 1,000 years before Christ, the kingdom of Israel groaned, literally, at the tax load that was placed upon them by King Solomon, 3rd king of Israel, son of David. You see, Solomon's lifestyle was such that he loved women, supported 700 wives. Again, probably one of those good and bad news kinds of situations. And when Solomon died, he had 2 sons and the kingdom had split, and Rehoboam became the king of Judah. And when people begged for tax relief, in a loose translation, Rehoboam basically said, "You ain't seen nothing yet." A king not worth having. One more from contemporary times, at least my contemporary times, the mid-60s to the end of the 70s somewhere. The fellow's name was Bokassa, and he was, his title at the time was president when he took power in a Central African nation. The last 3 years of his life, he decided to change his title to emperor. And when he did so, he threw a party for 3,500 guests from 43 different nations. He had a throne built that was shaped like an eagle, had 800 feathers that were made of gold, a robe of velvet, on it 750,000 pearls, a scepter, his wife's tiara that cost $5 million. It took 240 tons of food at the feast. His guests were transported in 60 brand new Mercedes-Benz. And of course, all the guests were flown in at Emperor Bukas's expense. Sounds a lot like King Xerxes when we read the book of Esther in many ways. Total cost of the party was $20 million in a country whose gross national product was $230 million a year. A king not worth having. History abounds with kings who were villains, crooks. We could name all kinds of adjectives to describe them. And then here in contrast, listening to what Charlie read in the scriptures from the Gospel of John. This festival of Christ the King Sunday, the last Sunday in Pentecost, before our new year begins next Sunday. We have a king worth having. Now you ask me why, and I would assume if we asked each and every one, we'd get great answers. And they'd probably be 100 to 1,000 different answers, because that's how great, that's how worthwhile this king is for us to have. I just chose 3 thoughts about why Jesus is a king worth having based on our text. A snapshot, if you will, of Jesus. First of all, he had courage to sacrifice himself. I'm sure we all notice, and it makes sense, we're told, for kings to stay out of the line of fire. For kings to go, you go fight, I'll stay back here. Obviously, supposedly, if the king gets picked off, if any kind of major leader gets picked off, it's a disadvantage. People fall into confusion and disarray. Apparently, that wasn't Jesus' strategy. He had total disregard for his personal safety. When you look at that, you think about the donkey. You think about the parade. You think about Passover in Jerusalem. And you think he got on that donkey and rode right in front of everybody to the holy city and right into the jaws of death. If you remember John, just a chapter earlier, chapter 11, in the raising of Lazarus, says this: Now the chief priests and the Pharisees had given orders that if anyone knew where Jesus was, he should let them know so that they might arrest him. He knew. He knew this last time, this last visit to Jerusalem would be the end, in a manner of speaking. John, just before this, tells the people were standing around in the temple and they were asking each other, what do you think? Oh, he'll never come to the feast. Are you out of your mind? Didn't you hear what they said? He'd be crazy to do that. And here Jesus comes in the face and the midst of his enemies, openly, in a parade. All that is sacred, everything that is spiritual in us must stand in awe as we realize the people there on that day waving their palms were crying, "Ride on, King Jesus. Ride on." What courage. What sacrifice for us. A king worth having. Not only was there a sacrificial courage, but Jesus was a king that's approachable. Rulers will oftentimes stay their distance, and again, probably rightly so. It makes sense. We have today armored cars, Secret Service. We have all kinds of security to protect those who need their safety protected. Others are subject to bow in the presence of someone else who's kingly. Others, if you remember, like King Xerxes in the book of Esther, if he saw you and didn't wave you forward, you were dead. You were history. Jesus, the Lord of the universe, does not even protect his own dignity in any way. Among other things, he rode on a donkey. Let's go back to that donkey. In those days, and probably even now, not much of an animal, really. Not real good looking. Was a beast of burden. And was usually owned by a poor person. In fact, may I suggest just reading Luke. Luke speaks of this particular donkey as one who had owners, plural. Perhaps 2 households, 3 households owned this one donkey. And yet, as poor as these owners of the donkey may have been, Jesus had to borrow it from them. These people still had more material goods than Jesus did. It is so amazing that there's not anyone ever that has been a person like Jesus in our world, nor will there ever be. Who cannot identify with him? You can be a wretch, a louse, you can be poor, you can be a lush, you can be a champion sinner, which I remind you we all are. And you never feel, when you read the Scriptures, when you experience the Spirit's in us, working through us, we realize that he never put himself out of reach of anyone. Our King is on everyone's level. Our King doesn't put himself above us. In fact, he died for us. Jesus is truly a king worth having. Sacrificial courage. Approachable. You know how it is where we can't even get our supervisors sometime to look at us, much less say something. And to hear words of love. Not often. Not often enough. Thirdly, Jesus does not force us to do anything. What happened to him on Palm Sunday? All the things, just for a few moments. He was cheered. They laid palm branches. They called his name. So much more was due. They didn't understand. We don't understand, even way on this side of the story. And really, he didn't want it, at least not before this. He shied away from it, really. If you remember right in the book of Mark, the Gospel of Mark, this messianic secret. Don't tell anybody of the signs and the wonders I do. Well, of course not. When there's news like that and no one's going to tell, you know how that goes. It was told and told and told. But people misunderstood who he was, what his purpose was. And so he didn't want anyone, his greatness, to show. Because people would take it wrong. Because Messiah to the people didn't mean riding on a donkey, it meant riding on a horse. It meant being in armor. It meant carrying a sword. It meant killing anyone in the way who has taken away from Israel what God certainly had entitled them and deserved them to have. We wanted, even with Jesus in that day, a wrong kind of king, a type not worth having. But now on this day, coming into Jerusalem at Passover, for the last time he would make a journey. It was time to take off the wrappings, if you will. Very much like we will do celebrating his birth starting next week. The secret, you see, needed to come out. Like the prophets of old needed to tell the secret, to have it come out. But they did so in such a way that was symbolic. Just as Jesus was doing. Came across, and I'm not sure why, I was reading Ezekiel, one of the Old Testament prophets, called one of the major prophets. I remember the stories about Ezekiel who took a sharp sword, and this is what first struck me, and used it as a razor to shave off his hair on his head and his face, his facial hair. And then he divided the hairs up into thirds. 1/3 was burned, 1/3 he stuck in the ground with a sword, and 1/3 he scattered in the wind. All to signify God's judgment on his own people for their idolatry. In that 1/3 would die, 1/3 would suffer illness, 1/3 would fall to battle and die, and 1/3 would scatter in the wind. It was hard to understand them when you read that. Here it's hard for us to understand Jesus' example. But it would show us as he rode in and would follow through on what we know as Holy Week. What kind of king he was. One worth having, and also what kind of allegiance that he sought. Zechariah, long after Ezekiel, but before Jesus, would forecast Jesus' style. Fear not, daughter of Zion, Zechariah wrote. Behold, your king is coming, sitting on a donkey's colt. Jesus would come, not in the spirit of war, but in a manner of peace, on a donkey. Not to mow people down, but to woo them. To woo them. We need to woo people more. We need to love people into the kingdom more. We need to realize that sometimes, even when we don't mean it, people are so fragile. We can say a word or two, not wooing, and we can lose them. We need to woo more. We need to be as the Revelation written by John shares. Same style, another picture of Jesus wooing, not forcing, Jesus inviting, Jesus waiting. John wrote these words that he heard Jesus say to him Behold, Jesus said, I stand at the door and knock. If anyone hears my voice and opens the door, I will come into them and eat with them, and they with me. Perhaps another way might help better understand and see. John Steiner's oratorio, The Crucifixion. There's a line in the prophet's chorus that Steiner calls the appeal of the crucified. And it's a look at Christ on Calvary. It's hard to imagine how we cannot see. And perhaps no words are necessary. But that sight, that vision, that picture in our mind, in itself is saying what it is the prophet said when he wrote, "Is it nothing to you, all ye that pass by?" Not with a sledgehammer, not submit or else. But this king worth having is one who knocks on the door, who holds on from the cross as we pass by. What is it that you see? He is one who has for us an invitation. One who says, "Come, come to me, all you who are weary and tired." Let's pray. The king that came on that first Palm Sunday was given allegiance. I mean, they rolled out the red carpet, branches. They responded to Jesus' symbolism with symbolism of their own. Lord, 2,000 years have passed, and the question is, how will we respond? How? A week before preparing for the Christ child in Advent, on this Christ the King Sunday, let us exalt a king worth having, the king. And there's a lot of competition. There's a lot of things that we feel is worth having. Let us see this king worth having with courage. Courage enough that he sacrificed himself for us. Give us what it is we stand in need of, but give us what we need to put us in line with your will. Help us somehow to give us that dignity which does not get in the way of touching those things that are lowest or poorest among us, or so we think. Let us follow one who deserves our allegiance, but does not force it upon us. Help us to see more clearly this one that's about to be born, to live among us. Jesus, a king worth having. Amen.